Hi class, so today we're going to be going over Chapter 1, Introduction to Psychology, and we're going to dive into the history of psychology. First, before I start, if you're writing notes, I want to start off by building connections. So if you're writing notes, or if you're just watching this video, go ahead and think about what you already know about psychology, and then what do you want to know about psychology? It's especially important to build connections to what you already know, to what you're about to learn in this video and throughout the course. So go ahead and take some time, either just in your head or on your notes, to answer these two questions. Then moving on, we're going to talk about the history of psychology, and here are some foundations of psychology. So first, what is psychology? What do you guys think psychology is? What comes to mind when you think of psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior, and it uses the scientific method to gain knowledge about the mind and behavior. The scientific method usually begins with a general interest or research question, such as I want to know more about how babies develop, or how do children first communicate. And then this goes on to form a hypothesis from the general interest or question. And a hypothesis is a question about how or why something happens, and a tentative explanation to explain that question. So for example, we might ask, according to our research question, we might make a hypothesis on infants who make more babbling sounds will begin talking earlier than infants who make less babbling sounds. And this hypothesis is linked to our general interest or initial question that we first had. And then this goes on to a broader scientific theory. So after we answer and do research on our hypothesis based on our results lends itself to a scientific theory, which is a broad explanation or many explanations for some aspect of the natural world that is consistently supported by evidence over time. Here's an example of how the scientific method works. So as I stated before, it starts with a research question, and this builds upon previous research theories. Then it goes on to a hypothesis, and this needs to be as specific as possible in order to answer the specific question that we want to answer. Next, we move on to the experiment, and this addresses the hypothesis and it builds out the methodology. It has independent variables and dependent variables, which I'll go over more in Chapter 2. And then we use stats to find results to our experiment, and whether our hypothesis is supported or not supported, we would report those results. If it's supported, then great, then that lends itself to the overarching scientific theory. If it doesn't, then we usually go back to our research question and pose a new question or pose a new hypothesis. And then afterwards, our results are usually published in journal articles. Going into the history of psychology, so psychology really started with the Greek. Psych means soul in Greek, and back then definitions of the soul and mind meant the same thing. And ology is the scientific study of something, so psychology refers to the scientific study of the mind. And anyone who investigated the mind did so through philosophy, in which they used logical arguments instead of science, which uses observation and experimentation. Our first figure that we'll learn about is named Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt. He is considered the first experimental psychologist, in which he viewed psychology as a scientific study of conscious experience. He founded the first psychology lab in 1879, which is said to be the start of the science of psychology. And he studied how we form sensations, images, and feelings through introspection. In order to study the conscious experience of the mind, he used introspection as a tool for observation and experimentation. And as you see here, introspection is the process of examining one's own conscious thoughts and emotions through monitoring and reporting one's own conscious experiences. To do this, he trained people who could immediately report an internal reaction within themselves. So by repeating the stimulus, these trained individuals would be able to see which stimuli produce which reaction in their mind. For example, he used a metronome ticking, as you could see here, as a stimulus, and had people reflect on their own internal experiences, such as how they felt in their mind when they heard that sound. He also researched reaction times to various stimuli, such as lights, images, or other sounds. And this method was the start to eliminating the use of logical arguments about interpreting the mind, and instead started implementing standardized testing of individuals. And even though introspection used standardized testing, it is considered inaccurate because there is really no way to know that a person is accurately observing their own mind. And one's process of trying to understand the structure of the mind led to Edward Titchener, a student of his, to bring psychology to the US, and he developed structuralism, which is a theory of identifying and understanding the building blocks of the mind and its components through introspection. Our next figure in psychology was William James. He was the first American psychologist who formed a new perspective on psychology. Some of his most notable achievements included he authored The Principles of Psychology, one of the first textbooks in psychology, and he initiated the psychological testing movement. William James was influenced by Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories of natural selection. Natural selection refers to organisms adapting certain traits in order to survive and reproduce in their environment. James studied how the mind of animals and humans work to fit their own environment, and he expanded psychology to include research on observable behaviors, animal behavior, and certain biological processes. And James's perspective became known as functionalism, which is the study of how mental activities help the organism fit to its environment. Contrary to structuralism, as I mentioned in the previous slide, functionalism was interested in how the entire mind operated instead of the parts that made up the collective mind. He believed in introspection, but used better observable measures such as recording devices and investigated how the mind and physiological processes collectively operated. Next, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Sigmund Freud proposed a non-scientific approach to psychology that was based on exploring what Freud called the unconscious. Freud introduced psychoanalytic theory, which focuses on the role a person's subconscious and how a person's childhood experiences influence their life. According to Freud, the unconscious mind was a place where feelings and urges collected but had no conscious awareness. Freud suggested the importance of unconscious processes and focus on unresolved conflicts between acceptable and unacceptable sexual and aggressive motives. In order to gain access to one's unconscious mind, Freud analyzed dreams. Freud examined the first words that came to people's minds, and through slips of the tongue, he would interpret his patient's unconscious issues. And we'll be learning more about Freud in Chapter 11 when we cover personality. But his influence to psychology established how therapists work today and how the impact of one's childhood can have towards someone later in life. And he popularized the method of patients sitting on a couch and talking to a therapist. And he does have a lot of criticism toward his ideas, as we'll discover later on in the semester. Moving on, Unlike structuralism, which analyzed the individual underlying mental structures of behavior, Gestalt psychology is focused on the behavior as a whole. The term Gestalt refers to how sensory experiences can be broken down into parts, and then how those parts make up the collective whole. So for example, as you see the word Gestalt here, it has individual parts that are separate but make up a collective whole to create the whole word. So each part has its own letter, and each letter has makes up the word Gestalt. And this might be an easy way for you to remember Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology became the foundation for humanism and sensation and perception, which we'll cover later in the semester. And Gestalt psychology was developed by these three gentlemen who immigrated from the US from Nazi Germany and introduced these Gestalt principles. And then just to recap, structuralism, Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and Gestalt principles were all concerned with the person's inner experiences, whether it be conscious or unconscious. Next, in the early 1900s, behaviorism was introduced. Behaviorism is the scientific study of human and animal behavior that can be explained by conditioning a response without the influence of feelings or thoughts. This approach is in direct opposition of the scientists and theories I previously mentioned, who studied the mind and a person's inner experiences. Instead of using one's thoughts or feelings to explain certain phenomena in the world, behaviorists use observational environmental influences on overt behavior to explain these phenomena. One of the first behaviorists that became known as the father of behaviorism was John B. Watson. Watson heavily criticized the study of the mind, believing that the mind was impossible to analyze for its lack of clear and observable measurements. Watson was a major factor to shifting the focus of psychology from the mind to behavior. And he was known for his Little Albert experiment, which I'll link a video in the supplemental videos to watch in this module. Behaviorism mainly used animals to test experiments on behavior, believing that animal behavior could be applied to human behavior. And the rise of behaviorism in the 20th century has influenced today's psychology scientists to practice more observable measures when creating experiments. Next, the earliest work of behaviorism came from Ivan Pavlov and his dog study. Pavlov studied how conditioned stimuli was introduced to a dog or animal and used to produce a conditioned response. So as you can see here, this was the basic layout of his experiment. He first introduced the dog to food, and the dog's natural response was to salivate or produce saliva. And then eventually he wanted to change the dog's behavior to produce saliva just from a bell. So in succession of giving him food, he would also ring the bell while giving him food. And soon enough, just by ringing the bell, the dog would salivate to the noise of the bell, even without the presence of food. And again, I'll link a video explaining his study in the supplemental videos as well. Next, we have B.F. Skinner. He was a behaviorist who investigated how behavior was influenced by consequences. He believed that punishment and reinforcement were the driving forces for behavior, such that there can be a cause and effect for behavior. His most famous study was called the Skinner box, which looked like this. In this experiment, he created a chamber that investigated operant conditioning, which is how behavior is modified through punishment and reinforcement. The Skinner box included a chamber, as you can see here or here, that had a wired bottom, lights, speakers that signaled the rat or the pigeon to press a lever to receive food in the dispenser. For example, the rat would receive reinforcement from the food if it pressed the lever. Eventually, the rats would accidentally press it and food would come out. But after repeated attempts at hitting the lever, the rat learned that the lever equaled food. But also, the rat would receive punishment from the electric shock or speaker sound when it pressed the lever instead of receiving food, and this produced punishment within the rat or the pigeon. In Chapter 6, we'll learn more about the different levels of punishment and reinforcements. But for now, that's all you need to know about B.F. Skinner. Then, a new perspective in the early 20th century emerged called humanism. American psychology was mostly focused on behaviorism and psychoanalysts until humanism emerged. Humanists disagreed with psychoanalytic theory for its negativity and idea that a person is determined by their past alone, and they disagreed with behaviorism for its simplification that humans are only driven by a combination of their genetics and their environment. Thus, humanism emerged as an idea that a person can progress to achieve control of their own life. And humanism is a psychological perspective that emphasizes humans are innately good, that people have free will, and they could aim towards self-actualization. One notable humanist was Abraham Maslow, who introduced the hierarchy of needs, such that as long as a person's basic survival needs are met, their higher level needs would motivate them to reach self-actualization. And we'll discuss more Maslow and his hierarchy in Chapter 10. Next, we have Carl Rogers. He was a humanist who was known for using a therapy technique called client-centered therapy, and was the first to use the term client instead of patient. In psychoanalytic theory, therapist plays an important role in interpreting conscious behavior from an unconscious mind, whereas client-centered therapy involved the client taking the lead in their own therapy. Rogers believed that therapists should have three basic things to maximize a client's treatment. This included unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. Unconditional positive regard refers to how therapists accept their clients for how they are, no matter what they say or do outside of their session. Genuineness refers to being open to the client's needs and allowing a client to self-disclose what they want to talk about. And then empathy refers to the ability to actively listen to their client and have an understanding for what their clients are going through. After the early work of humanists, the psychology community focused more toward the study of the mind. Around the 1950s, psychology was becoming more science-driven with the emergence of computer science, neuroscience, and the beginning of NASA. And this movement towards science created an interest in cognitive psychology, which is the scientific study of mental processes such as how language is learned, how memory is retained, problem solving, and how we think. The first person to publish the first psychology textbook was Ulrich Neisser, which was very popular and widely used among psychology courses. But psychology or cognitive psychology didn't really get its footing until Noam Chomsky. He was a trained linguist, a person who studies different languages and how language is formed. He disagreed with behaviorism's perspective that language is a learned behavior and that mental processes are required to learn certain behaviors. Throughout his life, he has been involved in politics, such as protesting wars. He's written a lot of books and gave a lot of speeches about his philosophy. The cognitive revolution in America, with the influence of Chomsky, helped make cognitive psychology popular in the United States and in Europe. Oh, and Noam Chomsky is still alive, and if you're interested in his perspective, you could search his YouTube channel called Democracy Now! And then moving on. As you may or may not have noticed, all of the psychology scientists I described were white men, but it is also really important to get many points of view from many different people. Many psychological theories represent a white American perspective that not only apply to other social groups or cultures. Not only is it important to gain different perspectives from multiple different sources, such as when we view media in the world, it is important to gain information from different cultures to add to the psychological theories that we have in place already. Multicultural psychology is the scientific study of how culture influences the mind and behavior, specifically how culture affects the way people think, feel, or act. Multicultural psychology originated from African American psychologists exploring cultural differences within the African American population. One notable African American who studied multicultural psychology was Cecil Summer, and he started his own psychology program at Howard University. And intelligence testing was one of the main focuses of multicultural psychology, which influenced the opportunities available for Black men and women to get jobs through intelligence testing. And then similar to multicultural psychology, feminist psychology emerged as a critique of male-dominated psychological research. Feminist psychology is a psychological focus on social structures and gender that focuses on the values and principles of women. Lack of diversity increases the risk of bias from just one perspective, and this one perspective that has been represented in the field of psychology for so many years can have a bias, and very few women were able to practice psychology up until the 1960s, but even then it was still very difficult for women to equally do research the same as men. Naomi Weisstein was influential for feminist psychology due to her published article that critiqued the field of psychology for its lack of women involvement. Also, the article criticized how male psychologists constructed the psychology of women out of their own cultural biases and without any experimental tests to prove the male biases of women. And her work became the foundation for feminist psychology. And moving on to other women and minorities in psychology, first is Mary Calkins. She completed a PhD at Harvard, but unfortunately was not awarded her degree due to her being an African American, and her research was on memory, and she was the first president of the APA, or the American Psychological Association, in 1905. Next we have Margaret Washburn, and she was the first woman awarded a PhD in 1894, and she was the second female president of the APA. We talked about Cecil Summer. He was the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology from Clark University, and eventually had his own psychology department at Howard University. And then we have Kenneth B. Clark, was the first African American president of the APA, and he and his wife conducted famous research on the effects of prejudice. And that's it for the history of psychology. If you're interested in more about the history of psychology, please see the supplemental videos and then move on to the next video. I'll see you guys soon. Thanks.